welcome the panelists.
Okay, so yeah, everyone sort of knows who we are already. The topic of the panel are psychedelics and media representations. When we say media, I just sort of want to define what that term means, at least in the context of this conversation. So I'm not only talking about news media, but kind of media more generally. So like how psychedelics are represented through storytelling in the public sphere. And so that can include oral tradition, literature, movies, radio, music, of course the news as well. And through all of these mediums, basically humanity has sort of negotiated its relationship to these plants, and the media has primed our relationship to how we consider them, either before we've experienced them or after, or just in the public conversation as a whole. So we just did intros, but I'll do mine and then the panelists will reintroduce themselves. I've been a journalist for a little over 4 years now, and I've been between here and New York, sometimes covering plant medicines out in Israel, Palestine. I just co-founded a magazine that uses psychedelics as a jumping off point to talk about mental health, spirituality, social equity, social justice, and other topics. It's called Double Blind. My mom is holding it up right there. We just launched officially at the beginning of June. We sponsored the World Ayahuasca Conference in Spain and Queering Psychedelics in San Francisco, and we have a whole lineup of events happening into 2020, and we're going to be doing online content later in August, and a second print already in December. So I've been sort of driving myself crazy with Double Blind. I'm also an editor at Civilized, which is a cannabis publication focused sort of on the cannabis lifestyle, and I edit features there. And broadly speaking, I've been covering cannabis, psychedelics, and Judaism and spirituality and religion for a handful of publications, including Vice, Playboy, Rolling Stone, High Times, and others. So I eat, breathe, and sleep cannabis and psychedelic conversations. Who wants to go first here? Zach, you want to go?
Sure. My name's Zach Leary. I guess in my life, holistically, I do work in the psychedelic community and outside of the psychedelic community, but appropriate for this forum, I host two podcasts, one called It's All Happening, and one I host the MAPS podcast, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and it's great to be here. First, Brad, thank you. Wallace, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I mean, I was really inspired at the event last year. So, I mean, my personal relationship with psychedelics has sort of like a roller coaster over my whole life. I spent my formative years not being able to get away with it, and I kind of grew up wanting to get away from it because I just wanted to become my own person, and thinking I was a little too close to the sun, and so I kind of went off and started another career that I still have part in my life, and that's of a technology and marketing consultant executive. But through the grace of whatever it is that brings grace, I found myself back in the psychedelic community, and it's been amazing. I host the MAPS podcast. I do guided journey work privately with people. I consult for various organizations, and starting to do some consulting in the cannabis world as sort of an agent at large. In terms of, it seems that what I do best in the psychedelic world is really map the cultural appropriation and relevancy for, I love what you said, Brad, about protecting the Renaissance. That's such a great phrase, and I'm going to borrow it often. I'll give you credit for it. that's what I'm trying to do.
Like I said, I'm Erika Schickel. I've been a journalist for about 20 years, and pretty much a straight down the line journalist. I was a book critic and for the LA Times for many years, and wrote on a number of subjects, did a lot of features and interviews and so on and so forth. I took psychedelics as a kid in the 70s, growing up, and was always an amazing experience, was always drawn to it. Went away from it for a long, long time. And then in the aughts, I joined a group of people, journalists, artists, who would take mushrooms together every 6 weeks or so. So I did that for 3 or 4 years regularly, and then parted ways. It became too recreational for me, and then got myself into a heap of personal trouble, and sort of hit bottom, and was and did an ayahuasca ceremony. And this was in 2011, and it was life-changing for me. And I have done several since, and hosted several out of my home, and worked with a shaman out of Detroit, who's been a great friend and a great guide. And when I had that experience, I realized how vital psychedelics are at this point in our evolution, in humanity's evolution. And I feel very passionately that they are coming, this renaissance is happening now for a reason. And I came to the LAPS conference wanting to write about it, wanting to get my feet wet in that area of journalism, and was fortunate to write about it for Leafly, which was a great outlet. And while I currently am not doing a lot of psychedelics, my interest remains. I just think it's an incredibly important conversation, and I want to be part of shaping that conversation, because I think that it's at risk in several different ways, and we'll get into that tonight. But that's what I'm hoping that I can contribute to tonight, is ways that we might talk about these plant medicines and also non-plant medicines that can help us to move forward and survive ourselves. So that's my jam. And I have terrible allergies right now. Forgive me. Not only is my shoulder broken, but I am in a haze of allergies. So if I seem a little sweaty and out of it, that's why.
We're used to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to give you everyone, and maybe a lot of you in the room already know this, but just an overview of where we are right now in psychedelia, or the psychedelic renaissance, is that MDMA for PTSD is due to become an FDA-approved prescription medication in assisted psychotherapy by 2021. They're in the third and final and that's led by MAPS, and they're in the third and final phase of FDA-approved research right now. Psilocybin also has been put on the FDA fast track for approval for treatment-resistant depression, and that's through Compass Pathways, which is a European for-profit company, which begs the question, how are we going to grapple with the up-and-coming quote-unquote psychedelic industry? If you think of the cannabis industry, we have the psychedelic industry that's in development, and the oxymoronic combination of capitalism and psychedelics, and Erika and I will get into that conversation a little bit later. Meanwhile, Denver and Oakland have both decriminalized mushrooms and all plants in the case of Oakland. And there's a statewide initiative here in California, Decriminalize California. Look it up if you guys are into that kind of political action. National initiative, and there's also a lobbying caucus right now called SPORE. It's like the Society for Psychedelics. Forget what every single letter in that stands for, but that's happening at a national level. AOC is involved. And so yeah, there's a lot of, basically there's a lot of psychedelic political work and scientific work happening at the same time concurrently. and we'll get into this later, but I just want to say now is that, you know, a lot of people in this room mentioned their involvement in the cannabis industry, and that's what I think psychedelics are about 5 to 10 years behind where cannabis was, or behind where cannabis is. And so a lot of the questions that we've had to ask ourselves in the process of legalizing, decriminalizing, and regulating cannabis, and going through scientific trials for that, we're also going to now have to ask ourselves for psilocybin or other psychedelic plants and chemicals. But I do want to say that for the mainstream media to paint it as if Western scientists have only just discovered psychedelics is obnoxious and inaccurate, and also sort of paints this homogenous picture a little bit of either like the scientists and clinicians in their laboratories, or you have the white hippie thing of the 60s, and what I want to do is sort of apply a psychedelic lens to the psychedelic conversation. So this sort of kaleidoscopic concept of looking at the diversity of where all of these plants are coming from. So basically what I want to do is just sort of do a little bit of I'm not going to ask myself questions, but if I were, I'm going to just do a sort of global run through of a couple, not all of the psychedelic plants out there, but a couple of the main ones that people maybe are most well known, and talk about how they've made their way into mythology and storytelling, and how that has sort of shaped a positive relationship to psychedelics before they were ultimately demonized by sort of the mainstream, and then undemonized. Zach put it a different way, like to heaven and hell and back to heaven again. So, so I'll start with cannabis. So specifically in Hindu mythology, cannabis is associated with the god Shiva, who's the destroyer, and he's the lord of yoga and mind-altering substances. And what that means to me is open to interpretation, but I like to think of Shiva as helping to destroy your ego, or at least put a dent in it. And so, what was that?
The fierce destroyer.
Yeah, and please also, both Zach and both of you, just add to whatever I'm saying. I want this to be a conversation, and anyone else in the room too, like feel free to cut in or correct me or ask a question or anything like that. So Shiva, or devotees of Shiva, for them, and for other Hindus as well, cannabis in the form of ganja, which is the flower, charas, which is sort of like a hash, and bhang, which is like a smoothie almost. It plays a sacramental role with Shiva devotees. There's an so when we talk about media, the first thing I want to talk about is oral tradition and storytelling. So there's an old tale that Shiva used to wander off for days, leaving his wife Parvati at home, and to lure him back to the house with his family, she would make him a concoction of bhang. Cannabis is also thought to help Shiva devotees achieve the Shiva state of consciousness. It's a yogic awareness to transcend the body and the ego. The man who just walked in is really into the Shiva state of consciousness. It's my dad. It's used as a sacrament and preceded by a chant or a prayer like Jai Shiva Shankara Hari Hari Ganja, or Shiva the Joy Giver, grant us infinity from the ganja. So the first appearance of bhang, obviously there's no specific, as with mythology or storytelling, even though these things do get written down. One of the initial representations of it is in this old southeastern tale of the churning of the oceans. So the Hindu gods had gotten into somewhat of a dispute with the demons, and they had to churn the cosmic ocean to recover Amrit, which was the elixir of immortality. And it was believed that cannabis plants grew wherever Amrit fell on the earth. In another version of the story, it was believed that Shiva was summoned to drink up the poison that he churned from the ocean, and his throat turned blue because of the agony of drinking up all the poison. It was too much to handle, so Parvati made him bhang to relieve the pain. So that's one of the first instances that we see of cannabis having a medicinal effect. And so Hinduism is not the only religion out there that has cannabis as sort of central to its origins. In the Bible, and so the Judeo-Christian tradition, cannabis is a big part of it's not only Jesus's, it's of the holy anointing oil. So it calls for 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much of fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of cannabism, which is cannabis, 500 shekels of cassia, that's all according to the sanctuary shekel, and a hind of olive oil. So when people talk about Christ sort of going around as a healer with his anointing oil, that was basically a cannabis topical.
Excuse me,
Yes.
what is that? Where is that found?
This is from in the Bible. I'm not.
Yeah, but where?
I actually didn't write the specific. I'll find the specific one. I put it in quotes, but I was dumb enough to not put it. But I'll find it for you. Yeah. I'm making a note of that for you. There are also a lot of other instances of not just cannabis in the anointing oil, but also sort of hemp as a commandment to be used in different ritualistic things, like the talit, which is like a prayer shawl that Jewish men wear, and also using cannabis in the temple. There was a commandment to basically hotbox the temple with cannabis incense before you could go in and pray in it. So again, there's a lot to the tradition of cannabis in Judeo-Christian as well, not to mention all over the Americas. And if I go into the whole tradition, I could spend 2 hours talking about cannabis. So I'm going to move on from that plant. Okay, so San Pedro, the cactus. One of the earliest depictions of that was in art. There was a painting of a man, of a being holding the cactus that was found in an old temple, and I'm going to mispronounce this, in Chavinda in Peru, and that was dated to be around 1300 BC. And it was also used generally just as a decorative motif, the same way now we're starting to see cannabis as a motif in fashion and whatever. I mean, again, that's not a novel concept. It's been happening forever. It was referred to as the cactus of vision. So when we talk about the slang around plant medicines, weed and cannabis and marijuana and dank and all of this stuff, as a journalist, my editors are always telling me which of these words to use. Also back in the day, it's interesting to see sort of the reverence with which people would describe all of the different plants. Even in the present Christianized mythology of the area, there was a legend that God hid the keys to heaven in a secret place, and that San Pedro or St. Peter used the magical powers of the cactus to find this place so that people of the world could share in that paradise. The oral tradition, however, goes both ways. So we're seeing instances of reverence for these plants, and then a lot of the Europeans who came to the Americas kind of were afraid of the native relationship to them and would demonize them. So one 16th century conquistador described San Pedro as a plant by which the natives were able to, quote, speak to the devil, who answers them in certain stones and other things they venerate. So already with that kind of quote, we're starting to see a tension between the old world and the new world, which would sort of proliferate and magnify throughout the Americas. There's all sorts of mythology and legends around all the plants. Another one, peyote, which Ken Kesey used as he was writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But among some of the tribes of the Sonoran Desert and mountains, about the sacredness of the peyote plant, how it was discovered was it came to a woman who had basically gotten separated from the tribe, and she had to care for herself on her own, and she had had a baby on her own at the same time, and she had to cut the cord with a knife from her pouch, the navel cord. And there were a group of buzzards soaring overhead, and she was freaking out, and she heard a voice talk to her, "Eat the plant that is growing beside you. That is life and blessing for you and all your people." And she was rejuvenated and found the group and went back to her uncle with a whole kind of pouch of peyote. And he noticed kind of the blessing that it was, and he called it a blessing, and that we must spread it throughout our people. Again, the Spanish conquerors of the area called it satanic trickery. Even so, part of what I believe is sort of the media around it is that specific to peyote, there's a whole, it's not even the ceremony around ingesting it, but there's a ceremony around the hunt to even find the peyote. So the people looking for it of the tribe will carry tobacco gourds and water and tortillas, and they'll prepare for the gathering of peyote, which includes already, before you're even, again, doing the peyote, a ritual confession and purification, which in some cases could include even public recitation of sexual encounters, but without any shame, resentment, or jealousy. And for each offense, basically the shaman will make a knot in a string, which at the end of the ritual they'll burn it. And then they'll pray for rain and fertility. And the shaman will tell the ancient peyote mythology, like they'll tell stories as they're going out on this hunt, and then they'll look for deer tracks, and the shaman will shoot the peyote cactus with an arrow and make an offering. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here with all these specific examples is that the media that people have been consuming around plant medicines is really in the culture and the tradition. There's a certain sort of cultural technology, I think, that informs a healthy relationship to the plants. Another one that I found interesting, and I'll go through this quickly because we have a lot more information to cover here. The Egyptian blue lily, or sacred blue lily, which was initially found along the Nile and other locations in East Africa, and it's since spread into other places like the Indian subcontinent and Thailand. And it is the flower is the symbol of the Egyptian deity Nefertem, so it's often depicted in Egyptian art, including carvings and paintings in the famous Temple of Karnak. It's frequently associated with dancing or in significant spiritual or magical rites, such as the rite of passage into the afterlife. The flower itself is mildly psychoactive and can be somewhat of a sedative. Some people compare the effects of the blue lily to MDMA because it's known to sexually arouse users, and some will say it's more along the lines of cannabis or codeine. Another one that I found interesting, and I've heard this tale a long time ago from a therapist in New York, but when natives were asked how they came to the exact combination of the active substances in ayahuasca, they simply said the mushrooms told us, which I thought was cute. It sort of shows a relationship between the plants.
Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
So ayahuasca, which is made from multiple plants together, when the natives were asked how they came, like how they figured that out, they said the mushrooms told us. So it was like one plant or fungus informing the other one.
Or I've also heard them just say like the plants just directly.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, whether that was under the influence or what, the idea is that like pre-written media, I guess, you had a lot of like art and storytelling and traditions that like affected people's intuition and relationships to the plants and how they would go about sort of discovering them, utilizing them ceremonially, medicinally, and so forth. And I just want to say, just based on that, is when we talk about medicinal or ceremonial uses, there's not really a distinction between the two. So today, is like in California, we have like adult use cannabis and medical marijuana, and I think that's sort of like a false dichotomy, as if like it's medicine can't be fun, or if you're having fun that's not medicinal, and it totally leaves out or fails to mention the spiritual uses. And so really the sacramental or spiritual recreational and medicinal are really all packaged into one thing, and that's why it's also
Medicalization is gotten to be a bad word.
yeah, and you have pharmaceutical companies like getting involved with cannabis, and part of their branding and investment and all of that is in opposition to the paradigms that don't need that, I guess. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. Okay, I don't want to get too much into. I feel like I have like 10 pages.
You really
here.
prepared.
I really prepared. He said 2-hour panel, and I was like, I'm gonna make this a 2-hour panel. Well, okay, so let me find out what I wanted to say here specifically.
You should write a book about all this.
Well, I'm writing a magazine, so we'll start there. This is quite interesting. Should I just move on to this?
Do you want to make a comment on the psychedelic gospel?
Psychedelic gospels? What comment specifically on what you want? Can you elaborate, please?
The influence of psychedelics, in particular mushrooms, and Christianity.
Oh, sure. Well, okay, yeah, I was actually just getting into
What's the name of your publication?
Double blind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So what you I guess in the Americas you have an interesting conflux of the native traditions that were there before the conquistadors and the influence of the European conquerors or colonizers or whatever you want to call them, and the existing traditions, and you sort of have a mix of Christianized mythology. So and you have that specifically, like I said, with San Pedro, you have it, all basically in Peru and Mexico and so forth. So specific to mushrooms, what I had here is that, first of all, mushrooms aren't only specific, like obviously you have them not only in Mexico, but really all over the place. The first evidence is in the form of stone paintings that Saharan Aboriginal tribes of North Africa have been using mushrooms from around 9,000 BC. Similar rock paintings were found in Spain around 6,000 years ago that suggest that psilocybe hispanica was used during certain religious rituals near Villar del Humo. It was referred to as flesh of the gods, of course, or Tenochtitlan. I never took Spanish or whatever. I can't pronounce it very well. But the Aztecs called it, and that was believed to be a type of quote-unquote magic mushroom. So the main person that I would associate with mushrooms is Maria Sabina, which I think she's an important person to reference because she's a woman, and when we talk about the main figures in psychedelia, like Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Ralph Metzner, you have all of these sort of like white men who are painting our image of it, but really Maria Sabina is not responsible, but one of the main people that we should consider when we think of mushrooms. And she referred to them as a word that I'm going to butcher, which was meaning worshipped objects that spring forth. And some Mazateks refer to the mushrooms by saying that that the little mushroom comes of itself. No one knows whence, like the wind that comes, we know not when or why. So the sacred mushrooms which Maria Sabina used during an all-night velada, or vigil, are usually harvested in the evening when the moon is full, although sometimes they are gathered in the day. Mushrooms gathered in the moonlight may sometimes be harvested by a young virgin. After they're collected, they must be taken to a church. They're placed on an altar to be blessed before the Holy Spirit. If the virgin who picked the mushrooms comes upon the carcass of a dead animal, one which had died along the path she follows, she must then discard the mushrooms and find a new path back to the field where the mushrooms grew. There she must gather up more fresh mushrooms and then find a new trail leading back to the church, hoping and praying that she will not come across any more dead animals. Once the mushrooms have been consecrated on the altar, then they're ready for use. So again, I guess specific to like the mix of like Christianity and and native tradition, you do have, it's not as if the natives, or I guess the people who are native to the land are in opposition to the Christian missionaries who came there. I mean, a lot of the time they really did adopt those traditions and belief system, but there was sort of a hostility, I think, from a lot of the Europeans who were coming there, feeling a little bit condemnation towards sort of this devil's nature, whatever, that they basically were afraid of. And I'll talk, and I'm about to get into sort of the European sort of fear of plants. But before I get into that, I just want to say a few more things. Another sort of feminist mythology that is worth noting is around iboga, which is a plant from the Bwiti, the origin in Bwiti in the Western Africa, and that's a feminist mythogen cherished by all Bwiti sects. The first human being to ever eat iboga was, in fact, this is mythology, was in fact a woman, Bansiku, as she was told to do by the spirits of the dead so she could see them and communicate with them. Similarly, a woman was the first to be initiated into the Bwiti cult. Bansiku was also the first woman to be sacrificed. Originally, it was part of the cult to offer a human sacrifice and enact ritual anthropophagy during the ceremony of initiation of new converts. It was done to recall the mythical event of Bansiku's human sacrifice. Today, chickens are sacrificed instead of human beings, and most of the rituals that take place during the Bwiti ceremonies involve ritualizing the ritualized reenactment of the original mythological event. The last thing I'll say before getting into sort of the European the European bent is just on acacia, which is a plant that was native to the Middle East, and it had DMT in it. And so when you think of Moses and the burning bush, going back to the Judeo-Christian, some researchers argue that Moses was in fact having a DMT experience from eating acacia, which was just sort of part of people's use and diet, and communing with God. So in Exodus 3, an angel appears out of a burning bush to Moses, which leads Moses to hearing the call of God. And in a nod back to earlier Egyptian and Assyrian practice, some scholars suggest that Moses was burning Acacia nilotica, a rich source of DMT, or also called the tree of life. You also have something interesting, which is that in Genesis chapter 32, Jacob wrestles with a man, and through his experience becomes Israel, naming the place Peniel, which sounds like the pineal gland. And as with Moses in the burning bush, Jacob has an experience of light, quote, and the sun rose upon him as he passed over Peniel, suggesting that the transfigured experience may have had an entheogenic origin and may of course also relate to the pineal gland as the gateway towards mystical experience. Okay, so kind of moving on from like the ancient oral tradition and stuff like that, and getting into Europe, there's sort of this fear as we move into like medieval times and then through the Renaissance and stuff like that. There becomes a little bit of a fear of people who are communing with plants, and you have the notion of a witch, specifically witches. You have witches and shamans, but they're sort of ostracized by society. Witches in particular were not actually bad people. They were often women who were gathering together. Sometimes they were lesbian, and they were basically medicine women with a, kind of, if you think of the witch's brew, double, toil and trouble, fire and burn, cauldron, bubble, that's from Macbeth. It's also referring to sort of the witches, one of the brews that they would make. And that would include hallucinogenic chemicals called tropane alkaloids that are made by a number of plants, including deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, and jimson weed. And during the Middle Ages, parts of these plants were used to make brews, ointments, or witches' salves for witchcraft, sorcery, and other activities. Somewhere along the line also, it was discovered that you could absorb these compounds through sweat glands in the armpit or sort of in the rectum or vagina, and so the witch's broom was actually basically them putting a topical on the broom and trying to like ride the broom and absorb the topical that way. And when you think of why are they flying on the broom, it kind of, you get this concept, you're getting high off the broomstick. And the last thing that I'll say, does anyone know the Santa Claus? The origin
Yeah,
of,
totally.
okay. So
I don't know. What
you
is
don't
it?
know. Okay, so there's this idea. Okay, so if you think of first of all, the Christmas motif with the red and white, it actually looks like a red mushroom with white speckles on it. And that's called the Amanita muscaria. And it was a hallucinogenic mushroom that used to grow around Siberia. And it was used in ancient ceremonies by shamans in the Far East. And then the reindeer in that area were known to eat these mushrooms. So man and beast alike were hallucinating. You can see the connection with Christmas in that Santa's riding with these reindeer. They're sort of kind of flying high. Maybe they're hallucinating, but Santa Claus is sort of a personification of that whole experience. There are several other specifically in the European mythology or European context. You had a lot, just kind of from my own research into Judaism, you had a lot of holy men who were keeping the laws of the laws of being kosher, which kept them at that time more, especially during medieval times when there would be outbreaks and stuff like that. If you were kosher and keeping your kitchen a certain way, you were probably surviving a little bit better. And so Jewish populations, aside from just basic anti-Semitism in Europe, were also people who were like, why are they doing so well here? Like, why are they so healthy? And a lot of it had to do with the laws of kashrut, and a lot of the rebbes, or like sort of the rabbinic leaders of the communities, were also medicine men, and stories of sort of smoking a pipe and putting all sorts of different types of plants in the pipe, and incorporating that into Jewish practice. And the father of, so it became Judaism in the medieval times became very dry, and there was a leader called the Baal Shem Tov, which he said, this is all too dry and academic and bookish. I want to imbue a sort of ecstatic vibe back into Judaism, with singing and dancing and getting high and all of that. And he was a medicine man, actually. And he would go around with his pipe, and he started the whole Hasidic movement, which at this point in time is now maybe a little bit less ecstatic than it started out as, but those were the origins. So what we went over just now, and I'm done with my bit, is an opposition between sort of different schools of thought. You have old school and new school. Old school sort of being like how psychedelics are, or psychedelic plants are just part of the culture. It's not like there's a distinction. And then new school with people kind of becoming afraid of them in places where there was more of a separation. So I'm gonna now get on with Zach's contributions. You want me to ask you, and then or you just want to talk?
Well, I'll talk first.
And then I'll.
Yeah, can I see the notes though?
Yes.
I mean, short-term memory loss, long-term memory gain. One thing I want to add to the Hindu tradition, just because it's a fascinating one. I mean, the anthropological data, it's a little fuzzy, but psilocybin, I mean, what's sacred to India? The cow, what grows in cow dung. Mushrooms, yeah. And a lot of the cultural anthropology that I've studied around it indicates that, in much of the Hindu traditions, an ecstatic form, of celebration is how you ritualize, and outside of Shivites too, the Vaishnavas, the worshippers of Krishna, I mean, it's singing and dancing in a very ecstatic kind of not subtle way. And especially to Krishna devotees, the cow is, so important. And if you look at many of the stories around, especially around Krishna's Leela, like when Krishna was a little baby stealing butter, his mother Yasoda, took him away from the butter. It's like, bad Krishna, stop stealing butter. Or bad Gopal, he wasn't Krishna yet, and opened up his little mouth where he was eating the butter and saw the universe inside of his mouth. And if you kind of put that all together and go visit India, it's a very psychedelic example of trying to, of expressing devotion. So I've been looking for a lot more of that because generally the Hindus today, it's, psychedelics, drugs of all kinds, except in Shivites with cannabis, but it's not prevalent throughout India. But anyway, I'm kind of taking us from the 50s till now, and I think it's a really important timeline to bear witness to because in the spirit of protecting the Renaissance and think of Game of Thrones, protecting the realm, there is a very distinct timeline of psychedelics appearing on the scene, just as I guess the threads of open-mindedness and alternative religion and alternative ways of alternative healing, exotic travel started becoming, a possibility for American culture, and that really happened in the 50s. Prior to that, going halfway across the world was not something anybody did because it was just logistically very, very complicated. But as air travel kind of started to happen, people were making their way to places like Mexico, Cuernavaca, and stuff like that to experience these plant medicines. And so I'm going to start with the 50s. I call it like there's 4 great examples of how psychedelics, and this goes outside of plant medicines, LSD and mushrooms, but sort of made their way into the zeitgeist of what was to become the 60s, and one thing that as what Tim Leary always used to say was, in order to understand the 60s, you must understand the 50s. And those of us, I'm not old enough to remember, but you must understand why the 60s was so important is because it counteracted the 50s, which was so small, rigid, tight, 2.5 children, white picket fence, very, very conventional way of looking at the world. But in 1953, Aldous Huxley was starting to experiment with mescaline, and in 1954 he wrote The Doors of Perception. And if you just think about that in a second, that's lost on a lot of people that book came out in 1954. This is way, way, way before things started getting really interesting. And then in 1957, and you can find this online, I'll send the link around, but Robert Gordon Wasson traveled to Mexico and wrote a piece called Skiing the Magic Mushroom. And this was published in Life magazine in 1957. And if you read it, it's very open-minded, it's really objective. It kind of paints it in a picture of more like exotic travel. It wasn't so much about the psychoactive or the spiritual experience, it was more about like a white man kind of going to an exotic part of Mexico, and this is just what they happen to give him. So it it slants it a little bit, but it's a fascinating time capsule because there's zero hysteria in it. Hysteria has not entered the picture yet. Started in 1958, Cary Grant Spent a lot of time at a place called the Psychiatric Institute of Beverly Hills, which was on Burton Way. And it was led by Humphrey Osmond and Oz Janiger, who were both at UCLA. But Cary Grant did numerous LSD sessions at the Psychiatric Institute of Beverly Hills in 1958. And there's a great documentary called Becoming Cary Grant. It's on Showtime. And it's basically like an oral recitation of his unpublished autobiography. But LSD blew it wide open for him. Made sense of Cary Grant was an invented persona. His name was Archibald Lewis, and he was homosexual, very complicated back then. And he was the most famous movie star in the world. And LSD put it all together for him, and he credits it for living the remainder of his life until 1986 and 1986 or 87 in peace and harmony and comfort with who he was. And then, which is this next example, I think, is one of the most fascinating ones of the entire psychedelic movement. Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, did LSD 5 times from 1959 to 1961. And he called it the Great Ego Sublimator. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was a documentary made recently that was a big part of it, and so more people know about it. But up until that documentary came out 5 years ago, so many people in AA not only didn't know about it, even though it's in official AA literature called Pass It On. It's a green book. You'll find it some AA meetings, but it's pretty obscure. But they would also argue with you. They would not believe you, that Bill W., the patron saint of AA, and he's an incredible man. He thought LSD was going to be, one of the primary cures for alcoholism there. And
It
he,
was started by a belladonna trip.
yeah. I mean, in the belladonna trip in the hospital in New York, produced chapter 4, How It Works, on the 12 steps. He got it in a download and wrote it in 2 hours as a result of the belladonna trip, which is fascinating. But the letters, there's some great correspondence between. I mean, it's still, I guess for the rest of my life, it will always be awkward for me because I never want to say my correspondence with my dad because I feel that sounds lame. So I refer to it as, an observer, but with Tim Leary. There's great correspondence between the two of them when he was at Harvard, and they're all online. You can read them. And Bill was only stopped because of his wife, because she saw what it could do to the fellowship. And then even though this was a legal drug at the time, the idea of using an external substance freaked her out, and she put the brakes on it. And that was Lois, but who knows if it wasn't for her. So, those 4 things, they're a really interesting framework for what was to come. First of all, those 4 guys, Huxley, Wilson, Grant, and Bill Wilson, had something in common. They were all white men in their 50s, successful, top of their fields, their respective fields. These weren't young, sort of lost searchers. They were very established, and already, had they even not gone on to do whatever was later, they would have already been legendary. So the reason that's important is because their intentions were really pure. They had nothing to gain publicly, only something to lose, and their intentions were really based off of, the beatnik movement of the 50s sort of gave a little spark of, alternative ways of living and thinking, and Eastern mysticism, especially playing a role here in Los Angeles. Paramahansa Yogananda, Srila Prabhupada, Krishnamurti, a lot of these guys, they came to LA because LA was the new world. The East was a little wary of these guys, and they came to LA, and so, you know, that kind of affected, LA has a very important role in psychedelics in the 50s, because it was an experimental place. It was a place for renegades. It was a place for new ways of thinking. And the East Coast wasn't quite ready for that until Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert got hired at Harvard University. And so, you know, the preface of this and the media's representation, it's really interesting to see, and I don't want to like sound, it's because it's not about right or wrong, or good or bad, or who fucked it up, or who's to blame, and you know, I want to really say that, but it's really interesting to see what went wrong and how it went wrong. You know, when Leary and Alpert were at Harvard, the entire basis of their research was their frustration with conventional psychology and psychotherapy as it was in 1959, 1960. You gotta understand, psychotherapists were, you know, laying on the couch, and the guy who was mostly Freudian, I mean, there was some Jungian stuff, but with the pipe and, you know, right, you know, it's just the cliche, you know, and it was a frustrating thing for these guys. And even before Alpert became Ram Dass and Tim became Tim, I mean, it really, I mean, they were restless intellectuals looking for more. And as you know, Tim famously said on his first mushroom trip in 1961, I learned more about the potential of psychology in the human mind than I have in the previous 14 years of psychotherapy in one trip. So immediately that set course, right? And if you look, and this is all evidence-based, if you look at the early coverage of what was going on at Harvard, it's all really good. It's all really positive. It was all, you know, I mean, albeit it had kind of a progressive slant to it, and it's not like, you know, the FDA was going to, you know, jump on board. But I mean, it was very objective. It was like this was fertile ground here. And so much so that, I mean, we're getting a little conspiracy theorist, but does anybody know who Mary Pinchot Meyer is? Mary Pinchot Meyer. There's a book called Mary's Mosaic. She was the wife of Henry Court, who was a very important government official and publisher, and then she kind of separated from him, and she was kind of like a Washington socialite, but very wealthy, and you know, had, because of her ex-husband, had a lot of interesting political ties, and she knew JFK pretty well. She was friendly with him, and she also happened to know Tim, and by all accounts, it's a book called Mary's Mosaic, and June of 1963, she gave Kennedy LSD while he was in office. And if you look at, and then in September of 1963 in Paris, Kennedy gave a very amazing speech on nuclear disarmament, on nuclear peace, and nuclear deproliferation. And this is at the height of the Cold War, right after the Bay of Pigs. And here's Kennedy talking about getting rid of nukes in Paris in September of 1963. And scared a lot of people. People did not want to hear this then. They were not into this pacifist, no nukes, let's get out of Vietnam, let's stop the arms race with the Russians talk that he was giving. There's no audio of it, but it is transcribed, and you can read it online. In November, he was killed.
Did he know what he was taking?
Huh?
Did he know that
Oh,
he
yeah.
was taking LSD?
Absolutely. It's unconfirmed. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's a little conspiracy theorist stuff. But my point of this is, since this is about media, the influence of media played a role in Mary Pinchot Meyer's relationship to LSD. You know, Huxley's book was, Doors of Perception was highly revered, and you know, Huxley wrote so many other books that were already required high school reading by that point, but he still wrote The Doors of Perception, and no one batted an eye on it. So 1963 rolled around, and four things, again fours, but there were four great cultural events that outside of psychedelics, but they're important to talk about. The death of Kennedy, of JFK getting killed, which was, you know, the end of the innocence. Anybody who will tell you who's there, who remembers it, that was the end of the presidency as everybody knew it. Number two, the Beatles coming to America. Like that, the significance of that cannot be exaggerated. I mean, it changed everything. Civil rights movement, you know, suddenly the civil rights movement became kind of cool, you know, and if you were kind of like a you know, college white kid, you know, kind of became cool to march with the blacks, you know, and it kind of, that was part of it. It sort of became like this thing, and I mean, in the South, tremendous problems, but, and then the war in Vietnam. And these four things, you know, they kind of swirled into a magic potion in a Pandora's box, and it's now what we call the 60s, right? And so again, in order to understand the 60s, you must understand the 50s. So, you know, the kids of the 60s, they weren't gonna smoke cigars and drink whiskey. That's what their dad did. You know, that was not, you know, so the intention and the inspiration was like, oh shit, well, you know, Mom, there's this Harvard professor. He's your age. And he says this is okay. You know, he says this is safe. This is okay. And there's this other guy. He's also a little older, and he's driving this crazy bus around the country. And they look like they're having fun. You know, and it became, because these four things, civil rights movement, the Beatles, and the war in Vietnam, they were youth movements. You know, they were driven by youth culture. And so this psychedelics got attached to youth culture. And, you know, at the beginning, you know, it was, we see a very gradual media representation. And if you look at, you know, the LSD story in Life magazine in 1965, still objective, still fair, still not very sensational. Then things started getting a little weird. And, you know, a funny thing happens when all of a sudden, you know, the stat that was given to me by Jim Fadiman was between 1967 and 1970, on any given weekend, there were 1 million people doing LSD in America. Probably, I don't know, I don't want to say not a good thing, but that's kind of problematic, you know? And it's problematic in the sense that, I mean, today that would be a great thing. And today it would be a great thing because we have so much data. We have a strong set and setting protocol. We have so much literature. We have so much to refer to. Then they were just shooting at the wind. And, you know, I mean, Doors of Perception was out and Psychedelic Experience came out, but it was not, you know, there just was not much to go by yet, you know? So, you know, stuff happened. And the media, you know, I look at it like, in hindsight, like it became a great story. This is the beginning of modern news, as you know, Vietnam was the first event. I mean, it wasn't a 24/7 cable news network, but it was the first event to sort of like have constant coverage all the time. And it just became a great story to demonize hippies.
Seemed like the media shifted tone.
It did, it definitely
Like-
shifted tone. yeah.
Like a lot of the headlines before 1966, or Newsweek in 1966, you had a headline, LSD and the mind drugs, or LSD art, the new experience that bombards the senses. Or in 1954, LSD and psychotherapy, it was called Dream Stuff in Time magazine. And then 1966, you have a headline, an epidemic of acid heads, psychotic illness blamed on LSD.
What year is that?
66.
66.
So it feels as if the mid-60s is when the media started to turn on
Yeah.
the.
I've actually heard it said, just to interject, that part of the fault of that was Timothy Leary.
That's not
Was,
true.
Michael Pollan in his book talks about it, and at the LAPS conference, was it Gabor Mate was talking about how the whole turn on, tune in, drop out thing, and the Merry Pranksters, when Leary went rogue from Harvard and started handing out massive doses.
He didn't hand out.
Or not him, but Ram Dass, or Kesey did, right?
Yeah.
That's what sort of turned the moment and made, and of course
Okay.
Nixon was in office.
How many people blame?
I'm not blaming, but I'm just saying as part of this
I'm not offended.
conversation,
Yeah.
that what happened was, whatever was happening in the media, which was sort of a tentative, tacit approval up until that point, then it sort of went, it went media happy.
Well, the thing is, what we don't, it's impossible for us to understand today is the 60s happened
Yeah.
around them. And that wasn't, Tim didn't try to make the 60s happen. Kesey didn't try. It happened around them. And it just was like
It was,
the
but
explosion.
the idea that the Merry Pranksterism is what cast a pall across and took it out of the laboratory. I mean,
One thing I want
you
to
know.
say is that the Merry Pranksters and Leary and Ram Dass, the Merry Pranksters were like a West Coast thing for a while.
Yeah.
And then
Yep.
Leary was on the East Coast for a while. And actually, when the Merry Pranksters made their way across the country to upstate New York, and from reading the book, it seemed like it was a little bit of a disappointing meeting for them because they were expecting something that was a lot more out of control than what actually was the situation up there.
Yeah, and there are two things, if you guys ever, the pranksters, I'm a deadhead, so I love Kesey, Jerry's my guy. Is today the day? Tomorrow is the day. You know what the acid tests were? How they physically worked? Paid $1 and you got a coffee cup of LSD. Anybody who walked in the door, there's no set or setting, there's nothing. Anybody who walked in the door, that's not a good idea. And I know it bored the Grateful Dead, and they were the house band, but that's not a great idea. And the acid tests in LA were in Watts, by the way, if anybody's curious. But that, and if you look at Tim's testimony, congressional special committee in front of Teddy Kennedy in 1967. I encourage everyone to watch it on YouTube. And this really isn't me being defensive, I promise, but it's me trying to protect the first Renaissance and correct history. If you watch the testimony, it is so academic and so non-sensational and so not that. It is, this isn't for everyone. This is not for your kids. This is for adults having the choice of cognitive liberty.
But it was a new conversation.
Yeah.
It was something, in a way, it seemed to me that in that moment, psychedelics jumped the shark a little bit.
They
And
did.
became the message and the tenor of that conversation. It became, because there was a youth revolution happening, a counterculture was happening, and psychedelics became sort of co-opted by the counterculture. It was very threatening to the establishment, and and once Nixon was in office, that was
over.
all she wrote.
Yeah, and there was nothing anyone could do about it.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that I think that it was a sort of a mixture, an admixture of events, but that wasn't necessarily helped by the Merry Pranksters. Not that it should have stayed in the laboratory, and not that people shouldn't have a lot of people shouldn't have tripped because, you know, but I think we lost control of the narrative in that.
I agree with that, but what I always come back to is there was no way for them to know it at the time.
Sure, of course not.
Yes, in
They were all just
hindsight,
doing what
they
they
were
were
just,
doing.
it seemed
Yeah.
like the right thing to do at
Sure,
the time.
sure.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, and during that time period, what were the harms that were happening then? Were there anything,
So-
like deaths or people with schizophrenic onset, something like that?
The thing is if you wanted to like show your opposition to the government, which was really showing your opposition to the Vietnam War, all you had to do was like grow out your hair, smoke weed, and like drop acid. And it was really that simple. Like that, like it was very easy to represent yourself as part of the youth movement and as part of being against the war movement, and they were sort of synonymous in a lot of ways. That said,
But-
like, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, well, it's a good question, and a lot of it does piggyback off what Madison was saying. It's there are, I mean, we all know, we can all admit here in this room that psychedelics aren't for everyone, right?
Yeah.
There was just too much of that.
Yeah,
Too
kids
many-
were swan diving off of
Too many
buildings. I mean, it
people
was
who were not,
scaring people.
they were not the right people to be taking in the
Yeah.
first place. And those people, like their parents were, you know,
Yeah.
conservative. And then it created like, you know, I mean, the big textbook sort of billboard example is Art Linkletter's daughter, which I hate bringing up because it's sensational bullshit, but it's a good one to talk about because it is a macrocosm of what was happening.
What happened with her?
She was an acid casualty and jumped off the building.
She what?
Was an acid casualty.
Yeah, she jumped off.
Where was it?
Where?
Yeah, where?
Here in LA.
Oh, really?
Yeah, at the Beverly Hilton Hotel.
Got it.
Actually.
Was she just on Odyssey?
It's unclear because she was already mentally ill.
Got it.
Yeah, and therein lies the rub. She
Right.
already was schizophrenic.
And that's something that really in media you need to be careful about, and
Yeah.
I want to discuss this, is like, as psychedelics are sort of making their way back into the mainstream conversation, is whereas before maybe the media didn't fully understand psychedelics, it was sensationalist, like acid's gonna make you go crazy. Today we can have a more nuanced conversation and be like, here are these studies that are happening. People with schizophrenia or other sort of underlying conditions are A, not included as study subjects, and B, if you have a history of that in your family, it's probably best that you're not going to be tripping. And also the concepts of, you know, when we talk about media and literature and stuff like that, like Leary did do a lot of writing about sort of the psychedelic experience, and I would say like that was some of the of the modern psychedelic mediascape that was sort of, at least for me reading that as like a freshman in college, I don't know, for me it was and then I for the first time.
You have to remember too that in the 1960s, you know, this kind of information was not in the conversation. It was not a Google search away. And people, and Aldous Huxley wrote his 54, and all of the information, all of the common knowledge about psychedelics had been buried in Western culture. You know, look at witchcraft, look at, you know, ancient traditions. That was something, especially by the 1950s, that our culture had pulled away from. Of, you know, a youth movement, countercultural movement happening that was thrown. You have the reappearance of old drugs that nobody really knew about in white culture. You have the appearance of new drugs in the form of LSD, which was suddenly able to be mass produced. I mean, it's not like peyote, where you have to go and source it from a plant in another location. I mean, it's being cooked up in labs and widely distributed. And you have a basic lack of safe practices, knowledge around safe practices. So it was just a perfect shitstorm.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean.
And you had in the news I guess.
Don't-
No, I was just gonna say, in the news was already demonizing Leary and Kesey, and they were on these most wanted lists, and I think that really made
Right.
it scary
They
for
were
people to,
Yeah.
there was,
Incredibly
and
threatening.
especially as these hippie kids kind of grew up a little bit, and, you know, we get into the 70s and the 80s, and they grew up and grew out of that lifestyle, some of them obviously stayed in it forever. There was a, yeah, my dad here.
One thing I want to add, though, which I think it's really important, and I don't say it just as a fan, but I think as I continue my work, is looking at the importance of rock and roll.
Of what?
Rock and roll. You know, rock and roll in some ways kind of held it down for decades, you know, without talking about it, you know, and like, you know, Sgt. Pepper's would be nothing, it wouldn't exist without LSD. And I only met Paul McCartney once, but that's the first thing he said to me. He says, without your dad and LSD, Sgt. Pepper's wouldn't exist. And I was like, whoa! I mean, that was pretty crazy. But, you know, rock and roll played such an important part because, you know, those guys, you know, they weren't out there as much in the media as we see rock stars today. But the music spoke for itself and kept mysticism. As Erika, you were talking about the absence of mysticism. It kept mysticism alive in kind of a subtle way, you know. I mean, Sgt. Pepper's and Grateful Dead, Dark Side of the Moon, you know, and I mean, on and on. It would not exist.
We didn't have the internet back then, but music served
Was,
that purpose.
yes.
It really bound people together and
Yeah.
it sent a message, exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sent a message about mysticism and about just potentials that needed to be realized.
Also, if we're going to mention Huxley, let's not forget Carlos Castaneda.
Yeah, of course.
And, you know, that was a huge source of.
And you know, it's so funny, Castaneda lived in the Palisades.
Yeah.
I mean, LA plays such an important
LA,
role. So
yeah.
Brad, you're...
When were most of Castaned's works?
Actually, I was listening to a podcast, and the guy was talking about when Albert Einstein died, they found LSD in his blood. So I was just thinking maybe he was the one like doing LSD or maybe psychedelic drug.
Didn't know that.
So he was like kind of creating those like mathematics.
Well, he was a huge cokehead. I mean, huge cokehead. Oh, yeah. You know, Freud, no, I'm sorry, I'm spaced. Freud, I'm talking about Freud as a cokehead. Yeah, I mean, so like those tendrils were out there, and I think that like, what's interesting in this moment is, you know, that we have the 60s, you know, as a sort of prescriptive for, you know, what went right and what went wrong, you know, what we learned and what we lost. And we lost a lot because of the 60s. And, you know, and I think we're sort of in this interesting moment now where psychedelics are back, not that they ever went away. And people are starting to understand, you know, as they are being separated from hippie culture, people are starting to understand how useful they are and how integrated they are in human history, that we are, you know, we are made of them, and that they have enormous soul healing properties.
So, I mean, speaking
Yeah.
to that point, like as, you know, just honing this back into the media conversation, seeing sort of like the chaos a little bit that was the 60s and 70s, and now here we are today building off of that. And so when we talk about the media, I mean, we're in a very specific demographic here in this room of people who are seeking out a psychedelically oriented place. But the mainstream people out there still are, you know, probably have this like stereotype of the 60s that informs their relationship to psychedelics. And I think the media today has taken a very clinical approach to the conversation. So it's really like all of these research studies and the policy and stuff like that, and there's not a lot of nuance to it. One thing that I'm also seeing is that there's sort of they will sensationalize the headline still by saying things like ecstasy for PTSD instead of MDMA, or magic mushrooms instead of psilocybin. But Erika, I guess I wanted to ask you, how do you, I mean, is the tone today too clinical, and how can we reintroduce the role of mysticism into the mainstream media conversation?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a tough question, and one that I struggle with a lot, because I think that both things are true and sort of oppositional. I truly believe in the clinical benefits of, you know, and really I'm very excited about all of the stuff that's being done around addiction and depression, and anxiety, around end-of-life anxiety, and you know, things that plague the human condition. I mean, these are medicines. They do treat these states of mind. And I think that we got so terrified by what happened in the 60s around psychedelics and the media, that there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction to frame them as only medicinal, having medicinal benefits. And I worry about that because I think that what's getting lost currently in the conversation around psychedelics is their ecstatic properties. And that if we think that psychedelics is just like a bunch of kids like going out to JT and like getting high for a weekend, and well, what's the point in that? We're losing a really important part of what psychedelics do. We are as beings need to have ecstatic experiences, and this is one of our surest routes to that. And we've lost touch with that tradition. We don't have that tradition. Everything that you talked about in your opening talk, which was so interesting, you know, you're describing societies in which, you know, ritual and mysticism are built in. And, you know, here in this society, we have divorced ourselves from that, except for in, you know, pockets. And as a human race, we suffer from that. And to say that, you know, drugs shouldn't be used recreationally, I think is doing a great disservice to ourselves, you know. I think we do need to recreate with drugs. And I also think we need to use drugs as drugs for medicinal purposes. And these plant medicines, and in that I include LSD, and also 5-MeO-DMT, the synthetic version, and you know, whatever, we know what we're talking about here. I mean, just have a huge and varied role to play for us in this moment, where our souls and our bodies are in just terrible, terrible peril, and our civilization is in peril. And then there's the third part of that, which is beyond the medicinal and the recreational, which is and by recreational too, I don't mean party hardy. I mean taking it as a way to cure the ennui that our culture is suffering from. And as anybody who has taken these substances knows, that it's really the most direct route to a sense of unity and love. And you know, I think as the last 2 days have shown us, with the terrible, terrible violence that's happening in this country, we're suffering a love crisis, you know. And you know, I look at these medicines, and you know, and I'm very happy for the depressed and the addicted, and I think like people like Gabor Mate and people who are working in those fields are doing crucial work. I'm more of a meta thinker, and I really feel like getting the word out and getting people connected through these medicines to themselves and to each other is the most efficient tool we have for saving ourselves from the situation we're in right now. Excuse me. And that's where I see really the most hope and the most urgency around psychedelics.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that one thing on the topic of mysticism is that psychedelic science is forcing scientists to grapple with the notion of mysticism altogether. So in the early 60s, I think it was 62, but I'm forgetting, there was something called the Good Friday experiment, where a bunch of divinity students took psilocybin and sort of basically just explored what that felt like. And then today also at Johns Hopkins you have a religious leaders study where they're recruiting religious leaders from all different faiths to come and also take psilocybin. And what's important about that is you're putting the concept of the mystical experience in scientific terms, which I'll define in a second, up against the mystical experience of people who supposedly are familiar with that state, with or without entheogens. So the mystical experience, scientifically defined, has 7 tenets. I don't have them all in front of me. One is like a noetic quality, which means like you can't really just ineffable or undefinable, like you can't really use words to describe it. Another is that there's like it's this paradoxical quality where you need to say sort of conflicting things to describe it. Another criteria is this feeling of ultimate reality. Another one is sacredness. Another one is I wish I had all 7 in front of me right now. But these are, you could just Google it, the mystical experience 7 criteria, and this is how scientists at Johns Hopkins, NYU, a bunch of research institutions are defining this, and now and the media is reporting on it. And what's I think so fascinating about that is the mechanism by which people are actually healing from treatment-resistant depression and other ailments, is the magnitude of the mystical experience they're having correlates directly with the degree to which they're actually healing, and that's going to be the way that these substances are going to gain FDA approval and become legal. Yeah.
Along with what you guys are saying, I think it's really important that this current Renaissance and movement involves aspects of like integration with mindfulness practice, spirituality, religion, whatever resonates with people, because in the psychedelic community and the spiritual community, and there's not overlap.
One thing I want to say is like psychedelics aren't really just about psychedelics. Like the application of psychedelic ethos is really like a big thing for me. Is like if you think of Ram Dass or Richard Albert, like he started out studying psychedelics at Harvard, and then he took sort of the psychedelic principles with him and traveled to India and became Ram Dass. And Be Here Now, I mean, is a very psychedelic book, but it's not explicitly.
But like even in that example, and I hear this quoted or misused all the time in my community, the Ram Dass community, of which I'm an intimate part of. Ram Dass did not stop taking psychedelics.
Yeah.
He did not stop after he met Maharaji. That is a complete falsity that goes around the New Age yoga community. Is that, oh, you can get the same thing through yoga, man. Ram Dass did it. No, he didn't. And it's like, I get that there are other ways to find God, and I would never say otherwise. But what Wallace said, you know, the integration through mindfulness practices and how they counteract each other is where it's at. Like, if you use mindfulness and have a great meditation practice on top of your psychedelic experience, and vice versa, it only gets better.
And that's one of the big differences between now and the 60s is that, you know, there is a real mindfulness, there's mind in the world, and you know, people, it is its own movement,
Actually, Buddha was like getting to psychedelic by meditation, because we already have the receptors in our body. If you have that receptor, it means your body already make that drop. So when people, they die, at the end of the dying process, their DMT in their brain is getting so strong and secreted. But people, they just like, they don't know how, we already have it. We already have it in our body.
But it's still not the same thing. I don't disagree.
It is not,
I don't disagree, but it's not the same thing. It's not meditating for 10 years is not the same.
When I meditate and, you know, sacrifice and being hungry all the time to get to that point, he didn't message to everybody, if you want to go getting close to God is not the way Buddha sit and like pray and meditate. You can get to that balance by doing that psychedelic like plant medicine, and you get the trip faster than you just like sitting and meditating all the time.
I like to say they are different rides in the same amusement park.
Absolutely, it's a really good analogy. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why I think it's so significant that these are rising up at this point is where we are in human history. I know, you know, the analogy of the ball and the bowl and how history moves slowly and slow, and then as it gets to the center, it goes really, really, really fast, and the ball is at the bottom of the bowl now, you know, and we are looking at limitations on what the planet can bear. And obviously people are turning against each other. I have met very few, I don't know anybody who's taken a psychedelic who has not come away with an understanding of what the unified field means, has experienced that. And you know, yeah.
I had you know, I was at UCLA when so much of this was going on, you know. I remember hearing from my friends and people that I knew, you know, there were a lot of stories coming out of the Neuropsychiatric Institute about young people who were tripping and who were brought in there absolutely catatonic and never came out of it. Which scared a lot of people, you know, scared me. But again, when I was about 13 or 14, I had a Hindu meditation master, and I became very adept at meditating. I really worked at it very hard and got good at it. And then my friends in college would say, oh, you gotta try this, you gotta try that. I would say, well, what does it do for you? And then they would describe to me their trip and what was happening. I would say, well, I don't know why I need to do it, because I'm already doing that in meditation. You know, so I don't, why would I do that? Then the other thing that worries me is, I think that psychedelic, I think about the Indians who used to go on their vision quests and they would take these things. But it's my understanding that prior to that, they had a lot of training. They didn't just grab something and swallow it or whatever they did. I mean, it took, they had their tribal medicine man and their people, they were trained before they went off to have these powerful experiences, which sound amazing, but I'm wondering if people today, you know, if we could legitimize it, if there could be some preparation and training so that
well, I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there are people in this room who do that, you know, and that's what we're saying is sort of different now than, you know, back in 50 years ago, is that there's a cultural conversation that allows people to have a safer experience if that's the path that they choose. And I think to get back to just sort of the subject of this talk, which is psychedelics in the media, you know, the question is, like, how do we frame this in the media? What is the media doing with psychedelics? And how are psychedelics being represented now in this second American iteration psychedelic movement? And I think we talked about this at length on the phone, you know, taking it out of the purely prescriptive, you know, which is currently where I think the media is, talking about prescriptive elements of plant medicines, which again, we all agree are terrific.
There's no right way.
There's no right way. And this is the other thing I want to say is that, as we all know, psychedelics have a way of meeting you where you are, unless you are a person who should not be taking them for some, you know, psychological reasons or psychochemical reasons. They have a way of meeting you where you are. So if you're a person who's dealing with chronic depression and you need to be microdosing, you know, hallelujah, microdose, you know, and how can we further that conversation so that it doesn't become misrepresented and doesn't fall under the pall of the like 60s rhetoric around psychedelics. If you are a person who needs to take a larger dose in a setting with a shaman or a therapist and, you know, Cary Grant it, you know, then how do we represent that in the media? And then, like as I said earlier, if you're a person who wants to just do that with your 3 best friends and have a different experience, one that's more recreational but also maybe cathartic in its own way, legalization is important for those people as well.
Yeah,
What about the pharmaceutical industry? I mean, if you're talking about psychedelics and the media is utterly dependent on the pharmaceutical companies as sponsors, and until you can get until you can get prescriptions for these things, I don't think you're going to be.
I mean, the thing with you can't patent psilocybin.
You can patent the process though.
You can patent the process, but you can't patent the process.
No, you can't patent.
You know, you can patent the process, but you can't.
But there are going to. Sorry, go on. Everyone else.
You can't patent the chemical compound.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank God, right? And this is also.
But they do try.
Well, and that's a big problem right now, right? Because the corporate America is going to get their hooks into it, just like they're trying to get their hooks into cannabis.
Right.
And
but it's not.
You know, and then it's going to be Mary bar the door. I mean, it's just going to be.
A few things that I wanted to say is that there's a notion of when you talk about like mentally preparing or sort of is set and setting. I want that to be as central to the media conversation with psychedelics as like don't drink and drive. B, there's a notion of meditating like a couple days or a couple weeks or getting into a meditation practice before you go in for a big trip, just to sort of like, it's like training for a marathon a little bit. Like you're gonna have a big mental experience, a heart experience, but you wanna have the little effects before that. And then also having access to and even knowing what an integration therapist is. And so like with double blind is like that's something that like we're specifically aiming to cover is like talking about integration therapy or like how do you trip or how to get through a quote unquote bad trip. Is a bad trip even a thing? But I think one thing is that the conversation around psychedelics in the media is becoming destigmatized and less pathologized in that like I don't think people think of psychedelics anymore as something that is like a big scary thing that's gonna fuck up your brain, but as like something to get well. So like we're like America in the age of Trump, and like at this time people aren't taking drugs so they can party and get fucked up. Everyone really wants to get well. Like you have this whole self-care buzzword, and you have like all these festivals like Burning Man and like the offshoots of you have like yoga and meditation and vegan food and all these things that people are basically trying to heal their individual bodies because the collective is so we're in such turmoil right now. However, the thing is with psychedelics is that I'm seeing or that I'm trying to write about and report on is that the like wellness of the individual is like part and parcel to wellness of the collective and wellness of, and vice versa. And so there's this old joke is, your kid is smoking pot if all of a sudden they care about political issues in the environment. Like the same thing I'd say applies even in greater magnitude to psychedelics, which is if your kid is using psychedelics, if all of a sudden maybe they, I don't know, like believe in God or something.
And I just really quickly, it's like the cognitive liberty discussion, we're not talking about that as much as we used to, I think. And it's really, really important not to lose sight of that because...
Well, that said, I just want to say one thing, which is that I worry about what I see happening with cannabis. I worry about everybody being high all the time. And I say this as a person who was high all the time for about 30 years. And I've been sober from cannabis for about 4 months now. And I really had to struggle to do that. And I mean, we live in LA, so We live in LA, and you know, everybody's vaping, and you know, you're walking through everybody's exhale every other minute. And I think that there is a point where it crosses over into desensitization.
Yeah.
And that corporate America is gonna just get on board with that, and everybody's just gonna be fucking stoned all the time. And then we're gonna lose, and the reason I gave it up was because I realized I no longer knew what my mind was without it, and that I needed to check back in and find out who I was. And I worry about that as like, you know, cannabis and all plant medicines as sort of a panacea for whatever ails you.
Yeah, like you know, what I always, it's such a great point, Erika, like before recreational cannabis was in California, like to me the most harmful thing that was going on in California cannabis was the abuse of medical cards.
Yeah.
I mean,
Medical what?
medical cards.
Yeah.
And we all did it.
Cannabis cards.
We all went to Venice Beach to get the $40 card. But like, that was kind of, we were hurting ourselves, our movement, by doing that.
Yeah.
By going and just, oh, I'm depressed, give me a card. You know, it's
I'm
like.
bored, give me a card.
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable with you right now,
And
give me a card.
We abuse the sanctity of it.
I would say that's the reason that we're dealing with corporate cannabis today, is when I started reporting on cannabis for the Village Voice in 2015, New York had just passed a medical marijuana program, and the legislators there told me, we don't want to be like California. Like, medical marijuana is a joke over there. And now, in response to having cannabis not be a joke, or medical cannabis not being a joke, you have all these sort of like pharmaceuticalized programs that are favoring basically like well-capitalized players in the cannabis industry, who, you know, whether you're in a state like New York, which only has medical, or you're in California, which has everything, you know, basically the regulations in all of the different states are now being written in such a way where you don't have the gray area that California kind of basked in for 20 years until we legalized pot. Like, you have very specific regulated programs that make it so that only the best capitalized players are able to play the game, which is pushing out family farms and small farmers. And to that point, I think that especially, you know, a day doesn't go by where you don't hear another CBD headline, and I like I'm boycotting the CBD publicists right now, but I'm really, there's CBD National CBD Day is coming up, and I think that's total. I mean, like,
No, there was such a thing.
no, it's like that's the definition of like corporate cannabis.
How about fireworks?
What? How about
How about fireworks for it?
fireworks?
National CBD Day.
Oh.
Huh.
Right. Yeah, it's yeah. I have so many opinions on National CBD Day, but
My brother's CBD has nothing to do with corporate anything.
well, no. The thing is, I don't want to demonize CBD, because the thing is, it is the media. If you remember, like the Sanjay Gupta's documentary on CNN on Paige Viggy using CBD for epilepsy, and like CBD sort of being so therapeutic to the people who need it. The concept of then, oh, here's a listicle of like 10 products where you have CBD in your chapstick. Someone's going to use that and be like, the CBD thing is bullshit, like, why do I care about it? And then when you're actually in a position to benefit from it, you've been turned off already. But the issue is I'm afraid that microdosing is the sort of the CBD of psychedelics, in that there's this whole media craze around microdosing. I have a really funny meme in here, actually, that says, you have a, I hope you guys all can see it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Brad posted that article about the coffee company
Right.
doing
Exactly.
CBD coffee.
Like, they're going to basically use the microdosing as a way in to sort of like turn. No company is going to be able to market like a massive trip unless you're like, you know, unless you're an actual pharmaceutical company that's trying to like get people to pay a lot to do your psilocybin therapy, and that's another issue of questions of access and affordability when you try to mix corporatization and psychedelics, which is like oxymoronic. But this meme says only 10 milligrams of psilocybin in the clinic helps me conquer the world. That's like the big guy standing here in a suit, and he's on Wall Street, or something that looks like Wall Street. And then you have a Baba sitting on the ground. He goes, 7 grams of mushrooms in the wood and you wouldn't need to conquer the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as the media craze starts to pick up around psilocybin specifically, because that's so easy to cultivate and it's so easy to microdose and so easy to put into gummy bears and chocolates and have a whole industry around it, like we're gonna have to deal with questions of access and affordability as the industry develops, and that's one thing I think the media needs to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the struggle remains what it always has been, which is, corporate America would like to just anesthetize us, and keep us as consumers. And the promise of psychedelics is awakeness, and stepping out of the dream. And it's a tightrope. It's a really fine line between the two. You can go in either direction so easily. And I think that's why the conversation around media and how psychedelics are represented is so important and delicate. And I'm not here with any kind of an answer about it. I mean, there's a lot of I find myself feeling like, both of the opposites are true at the same time. And writing about psychedelics in a sort of compelling way is very difficult because of the noetic quality of the psychedelic experience. It's a kind of you have to be there situation. Yeah, Wallace?
I was just going to say that I think that the psychedelic movement can even help restructure business, corporate America, politics. Like the psychedelic movement can actually help that, because in the Hindu tradition there are the yugas, which are the 24,000-year cycle of things, and right now we're just coming up on the ascending yuga. And so I think that even in just the grander scheme of things, we're out of the dark ages and coming up to our full potential and our awakening. And I think with the psychedelics pushing that, we're going to see new structures forming, maybe not around it, but maybe influenced just by it.
Yeah. God, I hope so.
I think you said everyone's trying to get better. Maybe it appears in mainstream, but if you go to a prison and check in on those people's realities, a lot of them aren't trying to get better.
Yeah.
And I see, when it comes to psychedelics, we talk about set and setting. Our culture is a set and setting, and media creates culture.
Yes.
So we can use media to shift our culture's perception and change the setting, because in the culture that we're now, people are taking psychedelics and they use them as a form to escape, just like any other drug, because of the setting of our culture.
Yeah.
So yes, we can use them to shift our culture, but it's really tricky because of the culture that is already existing.
Right. I mean, why are so many people depressed and addicted? I mean, I just read Ayat Waldman's book, A Really Good Day, pain in her shoulder. And, so she starts this course of microdosing, and of course it works and she does great, and that's great, But I look at it, I'm not to be all like Marianne Williamson, why are we treating, why are we all depressed and addicted? There's something is at work that is getting us to this place where we need an antidote. And I guess I'm more interested in psychedelics as a way to just get us away from getting into that place in the first place. Like a psychedelic culture that allows preventative, that it'll give space to people to react sanely to the culture that we're living in. It makes sense to be depressed. And I'm not saying that people who are depressed aren't really dealing with something that's profound and life-altering, and that it's an easy place to get out of, and that they shouldn't have access to the drugs that they need. But we are as a culture very sick, and I think that that's a better place for.
I think to look at the application of psychedelic ethos outside just psychedelics, right? So Marianne Williamson, I would say, is the most psychedelic candidate out there right now. But love her or hate her, because her rhetoric is sort of like psychedelic, right? Like when you bring notions of love into the political conversation.
And she's done
and she's done psychedelics.
And she has done psychedelics.
Right, so maybe that's informed by psychedelics, but now it's like, what is the next step, right? So Ken Kesey talked about like the culture sort of getting stuck a little bit, like everyone had like discovered LSD and like now what? And like I think we're at right now that our chapter is the now what, right? Like we're in such a dire political and environmental situation that like how can like okay now that we've like like we're there's a psychedelic renaissance and the scientists are catching on again and some of the politicians are catching on again. This isn't just about like getting psychedelic therapy into the more mainstream and hoping that is affordable and accessible, but then also like using psychedelic principles in other areas of where we are today. So in politics or in your environmental aspect, whatever.
I think the big question is, are psychedelics going to be co-opted into the sickness and dysfunction and toxicity of the culture and only end up just reinforcing all of that?
But it's a great question, but there are a lot of parallels in the yoga community. The explosion of asana, especially here in LA, like 15, 20 years ago, right? If you keep doing enough asana, eventually you're going to start kind of like, oh shit, I'm feeling more than stretching. Something's going to awaken in you. And that might be true in psychedelics.
Maybe.
But it's going to work in spite of yourself.
But there's a lot of Lululemons, and there's a lot of I'm more awake than you, and look how great I am and more holistic I am.
Of course.
And let me also just say, I was Bikram Chowdhury's ghostwriter, and so I was, he's the bad shaman of yoga.
Yeah. No, I know.
The issue is if psychedelics are actually going to create a revolution, by which I don't necessarily mean like a violent or bloody revolution, but some sort of change in the culture, how can that happen in a way that has wisdom in it? Because what I see happening also a lot in the psychedelic community is, and sorry to diss this phrase for anybody who likes it, but the adolescent mentality people who are like, give me my cognitive liberty, and they're coming from such an immature like teenage mentality around all of it, and there's no like I don't see them actually embodying what I consider to be the good values of psychedelics. I see them just being like rebellious teenagers, and I see a lot of narcissism and a lot of bliss chasing and a lot of that, which is just part of the cultural toxicity. And so like how do we do if indeed psychedelics are actually going to transform the culture, how do we do that in a way that has wisdom to it? And I don't know what
mindfulness stuff.
But even mindfulness has become a whole
that's in the media. It's like the way
This guy is
maybe we need the psychedelic equivalent of the NRA. The NRA is a very effective lobbying organization.
That's what Madison is kind of trying to do.
Yeah, you sit around and wait for the people.
Well, that's kind of what
to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's a potentially powerful.
Could I just add too that what I'm hearing here, this is the Medicinal Plant Society, right? So there's more to medicinal plants than psychedelics. And perhaps it would be wise to look at a somewhat larger spectrum, because when you're dealing with, for example, flower essences, these go in and they can actually change genetic expression. They can radically change or erase the transgenerational issues. So much of these things that people are suffering from now are transgenerational. You go back into their their bloodlines and so on. You find that these problems are inherited. And the thing about the part of the plant kingdom represented by the powerful flowers is that they are able to act on these energetic and vibratory malaise that are inherited. And I don't see any reason why we can't try to, get rid of these things that are making us want to trip in the first place, And then, instead of be desperate for a trip, use these psychedelics to experience the divine, without having to worry about healing the pain that another part of the plant kingdom can take care of.
I feel like we listen to each other and we usually have change through hearing what friends and loved ones say. I feel like hearing all this stuff, it would be helpful if there was a synthesization of the 4 agreements. A lot of people know what it is, and they've generally heard about it and can understand it, and it's quickly synthesized. You should read the whole book, but within a minute or two, you can get the basis for it.
Yeah.
So I feel like if there was that kind of way for people to remember, 5 facts about this conversation that could be easily passed and understood. I just had the idea right now, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's good.
Some way to pass this along verbally to people that kind of hooks them.
Right.
That it gives them the facts, while at the same time helping them understand and maybe.
That's why things like this are so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many groups like this. I only recently discovered in the last year, because through my podcast, people ask me, where do I go? I'm from Portland. And there's groups like this all over the country. Yeah, popping up, and Toledo, Ohio has a mystical plant society.
And is MAPS tracking all of these groups and trying to?
To be determined.
Right.
Starting to, and I'm sending them stuff. And
Yeah.
We're trying to coalesce it a little bit, but MAPS is trying to. They also don't want to be like a psychedelic how-to.
I mean, because I feel like what I'm getting out of this conversation is, how do we hang on to the conversation and not let corporate America take it over and turn it into, another sickness,
And this is a. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, we're kind of out of time, but the Not So Fast on Magic Mushrooms, Michael Pollan, New York Times thing, this is so indicative of the problem to me. It's that was the perfect opportunity. And that article was 90% great, but the 10% that was bad was so bad.
What was it?
Huh?
What was that 10%?
Don't legalize, don't decriminalize. We're not ready.
That's what he said.
We don't know enough yet.
We don't know enough about it.
And we know too much. I mean, this has been going on for thousands of years, and it was just so and it fell onto the corporate default position, which is
fear-based.
But the 90% was also good. So
One thing is just that I see in cannabis is you have a lot of media companies that are compromised by their ad sales from the cannabis industry, and they can't report fairly or accurately and hold they can't hold the industry accountable. And in order to hold the psychedelic industry accountable, I think it's just really important to be a conscious consumer of your media and to know where they're getting their money from, how that's influencing the editorial, and support good journalism that's really out to
buy double blind.
Buy double blind.
Well,
Yeah.
and then there's also media being supported by pharma, which is a much bigger problem. And I don't know how much you guys are aware of this, but Facebook is shutting down alternative health groups right and left. I have admin about a dozen of them that have just been shut down with no warning. And my cannabis groups are no longer searchable. For me, I'm in the groups, and when I put the cannabis group name in the search bar, it doesn't come up.
Really?
So I have to go into my list of 500 groups and go through to try and find where it is,
That's
find a
what
damn group. I mean, they're basically making it really, and Facebook has been taken over by corporate.
I mean, Facebook is bad.
So, but I mean, it's big. It's maybe the primary source of media. So,
Yeah,
We're out of time.
I think
We're out of time, but clearly
Yeah.
it's a larger conversation.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.